Të nderuar shikues të Euronews Albania, përshëndetje. Mirë se erdhët në Berlin Talks. Siç e sugjeron edhe emri, qëllimi i këtij emisioni është të diskutojë me të ftuar ekspert disa prej tematikave më të ndjeshme që do të diskutohen në samitin e Tiranës që do të zhvillohet në mes të muajit tetor në kuadrin e procesit të Berlinit. Në emisionin e sotëm kam kënaqësinë që të diskutoj ndoshta temën më të rëndësishme, antarësimin e vendeve të Ballkanit Perëndimor në strukturat e Bashkimit Evropian. Për ta bërë këtë bisedë, unë kam kënaqësinë që në lidhje direkte nga Athina të jetë doktoresh Ana Kristinovska, e cila punon për Fondacionin Helenik për Politikën Evropiane dhe Politikën e Jashtme. Dr. Kristinovska, thank you very much indeed for finding time to talk to us about the subject, which is extremely interesting but very demanding at the same time.
It's a pleasure to be, at least virtually, with you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Kristinovska, I just wanted to start based on the material that you are going to put forward to the leaders of the Western Balkans and the Western leaders as well regarding the enlargement process. And the first sentence is very meaningful. The first question is probably crucial. You say, Russia's aggression towards Ukraine served as an awakening moment for Europe, a moment to reinvigorate the enlargement process in order to anchor the Western Balkan to the European Union. Do you find it present in the will of the EU member countries to attract, if I can use this word, the Western Balkans into their structure?
Those are not my words, although I fully subscribe to what the High Representative Josep Borrell said. And I think they illustrate perfectly the change that has happened within the EU and its member states after Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. Enlargement, while it has always been a topic of crucial importance for us in the region, was not on the top of the EU's policymakers' agenda before the war. And the war simply heightened the awareness that the Western Balkans should be in the EU, not only because they belong culturally, historically in the EU, geographically as well, but also because there is a serious risk of destabilization in the region as a result of mostly Russian activities if these countries are not integrated in the EU as soon as possible.
Dr. Kristinovska, the so-called enlargement fatigue and national politics on both the side of the European Union and Western Balkan countries have led the region's EU integration into a vicious circle. Lack of reforms, lack of progress in the negotiations, and in turn, lack of incentive for further reforms. These are probably the elements that have kept the region in a standby mode, which is not appreciated by the people who make up this region.
Of course, after maybe as early as Romania and Bulgaria joined the EU, we see that there is a sort of reluctance on the side of the EU to accept new members, and that has become even more visible after Croatia joined in 2013. We initially had a Directorate General for Enlargement, which was transformed into Directorate General for the Neighborhood, which meant that the focus was not on enlargement, but on the relations not only with the Western Balkans, but with all the countries in the EU's neighborhood, the Southern Partnership, the Eastern Partnership as well. And then there was the statement of the former president of the European Commission, Juncker, who said that there will be no enlargement until 2025. And probably it was a reflection of the reality at the time, but it resonated very bad in the region, and it somehow stripped away from us the European perspective. So in the meantime, the result of all these activities on the EU level in the region was that there was simply no appetite for reforms. So the enlargement fatigue on the side of the EU translated into reform fatigue on the side of the Western Balkan countries. And many reforms which needed the push of a credible accession perspective were somehow abandoned or postponed for some later time. leaders in the region focused on other things, and simply enlargement was not a priority, apparently, for any side in terms of the actions. It remained maybe a priority for the leaders in terms of words, but there was no serious political commitment.
Yep, completely true. Dr. Krystinovska, in the report prepared by the Hellenic Foundation, it is written an important element which I wanted to discuss with you. Finding the right balance between the technical processes, the strategic approach, and political commitment between what needs to be done at the EU level and at the level of the candidate countries could lead to a virtuous instead of a current vicious circle in EU enlargement policy. So these are the three crucial elements which probably the leaders have to tackle during the Tirana summit of the Berlin process.
I honestly hope that they will at least start to tackle these issues in Tirana, because these issues have been somehow swept under the carpet for a very, very long time. And as we said, there was a vicious circle. The wrong political messaging on the side of the EU led to wrong political developments in our countries. So it is high time to somehow rectify this situation. And it is very intertwined. That is why we are talking about a vicious circle or a virtuous circle.
Correct.
A credible promise and a credible pathway to achieving membership for the Western Balkans will certainly incentivize the reforms in the countries. And this is a process that has to start somewhere. I honestly hope that Tirana will be the place for the EU to undertake more credible commitments and a more ambitious agenda in terms of enlargement. Enlargement is said to be a highly technical process, but given the current circumstances, the war in Ukraine, and the pressing need to integrate these countries, it is time to think a bit in more strategic and political terms. Of course, these countries should deliver on all the aspects related to the European acquis or the European legislation that they need to integrate. But we somehow should not miss and not see the forest because of the trees. So that is
Correct.
why we need to focus on the political importance, the key political reforms that need to be implemented for this region to join the EU as soon as possible. And probably the technical details can be sorted out at some later stage in order to first rehabilitate or re-establish this new dynamic in the enlargement process.
Dr. Krystinovska, while you are talking about these crucial issues, I just wanted to ask you a very straightforward question based on your huge expertise in the region. You mentioned that the key precondition for advancing the Western Balkans EU integration is political commitment. And obviously, all the member countries of the Western Balkans have articulated, at least theoretically, that they want to join the European Union. But do you believe that all the member countries of the Western Balkans have this as their main agenda, or this agenda interferes with their internal political situation or internal affiliations with other players outside the region?
I think that until now, it was not very visible whether this political commitment is indeed there, because any political commitment or any positive development in the region was simply not going to be rewarded with any progress in the accession talks. If the countries have a clear roadmap, what they need to do, let's say in terms of 3 to 5 years' time, then it will be very easy to see if they deliver on these results or not. It would be up for the EU to establish this very strict conditionality between the delivery on the reforms and the progress in the accession. And what you are saying about the internal powers, I think that is somehow secondary to the importance of a very honest and straightforward relationship between our governments and the EU. with a credible accession perspective, with a very honest approach to everything that needs to be implemented in terms of domestic reforms, I don't think that other external players stand any chance to interfere in the way. So I think political commitment on the side of the EU and on the side of the Western Balkans is the most important thing at the moment.
Absolutely. Dr. Krystynovska, I just wanted to underline an element that you touched upon in one of your answers. EU should set a target for both the EU and candidate countries to finish their internal reforms. And obviously, the year 2030 was mentioned as a target for the EU to be ready to admit new members, both by the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, and the European Parliament. It has great potential to incentivize the Western Balkan countries to deliver and advance in fulfilling the membership criteria. But as we followed this announcement of Mr. Michel, there was again a lot of controversy. Are we ready? Will they be ready? So these cacophonous voices, how can we put an end to this discussion or this debate by setting a date where the European Union will be ready, and at the same time all the Western Balkan countries would be ready as well to join the European Union?
If we ask the question whether we are ready, I don't think that anyone is ready, not the EU, not the countries in the Western Balkans. And that is precisely how 2030 is framed. It is not framed as a guarantee for membership, but it is framed in a way as a best case scenario. That means that the countries that are probably the most advanced in terms of alignment with the EU have the opportunity to speed up their internal reforms and processes and catch up by 2030. That would be the ideal scenario, but it is certainly not a promise. So these countries cannot afford to stand just there with their hands crossed and do nothing. They need to roll up their sleeves and intensify the reforms. If we take, for instance, the case of North Macedonia, a country that has been a candidate since 2005, in 18 years, we are only halfway ready at around 45% in terms of alignment with the acquis. So this pace is certainly not sufficient, neither for North Macedonia nor for the countries in the region, if they are serious and if they have the ambition to join in 2030. Having said that, having a year that is probably the closest scenario, the best case scenario is certainly encouraging for the countries in the region to somehow do that and speed up. So I think that it was a very welcome gesture on the side of the EU to finally set a date after years and years of intensive lobbying and advocacy on the side of the Western Balkans.
Dr. Krystynovska, I wanted to follow up with another question. It is important you underline the fact that the European Commission should prepare individual accession action plans in coordination with the candidate countries. Are you hopeful that such a thing will clear up the air for both sides and they can move fast forward to reach the final goal?
Definitely. This is an experience that we already had as a practice in the 2000s when Croatia at the time, but also North Macedonia were candidates for membership. And they were receiving accession partnerships from the European institutions that were published in the European Official Gazette. At this time, where the countries have a bit sidelined from their accession path, where they are usually not very clear what they need to do, or where there is no political will to prioritize properly the reforms, precise documents, sort of roadmaps or plans for the next 3 to 5 years will certainly help the countries set up the priorities right and keep their focus on what the most important, the most pressing issues are.
Dr. Krystynovska, you underline an important element, and you say the European Commission should introduce intermediary milestones related to the individual's AAPs to put forward concrete incentives to implement the needed reforms by re-establishing the link between the reforms or the efforts and the membership and the reward. Do you think this approach will yield concrete results within this period that you underline, which is important to get closer?
Yes, if you consider the time necessary for countries that joined the EU in previous enlargement rounds to start and finish their negotiations, that was between 5 to 7 years. So the process for Croatia, Romania, Bulgaria, or the countries from Central Europe lasted in total not more than a decade. If we consider our region, North Macedonia has been a candidate country for 18 years. Montenegro and Serbia are in the negotiation process for 10 years and more. So this time horizon is simply too long.
Exactly.
And there is no direct link between the political effort, the reforms that are being implemented, and the end result, which would be membership. We should not have illusions that the process will be very quick. So we are certainly going to have several, if not years, if not a decade for the other countries. So given how long this time is, it is important to somehow provide these countries with some incentive, with some reform that will help them to implement the reforms. So that is why we are proposing that once a set of reforms or the alignment in some area is finalized, that the countries should be rewarded in a way, whether that would be with access to the European single market, whether that would mean more pre-accession funds or access to some of the other EU funding programs, whether that would mean participate as observers in different meetings in the Council, in the Commission. That is probably up to the EU institutions to decide, but there should certainly be some sort of link between the effort and the commitment on the side of the Western Balkans and the reward with specific tangible progress in the accession process.
That will be very interesting indeed. And now I want to ask you a question which is too close to my heart. While reading your report, Dr. Krystynovska, you mentioned the use of veto for issues unrelated to the enlargement criteria has caused serious damage to the prospects for the EU to become a genuinely geopolitical player. It has created frustration in the Western Balkans and has paved the way for increased influence of EU's competitors, Russia, China, and other factors. Do you think that this is a major issue which should be addressed properly, and not only addressed, but even given a solution to it in the near future?
Of course, the veto in the enlargement policy has been a tool that member states have had at their disposal for more than 5 or 6 decades. But in recent years, it has been somehow intensifying.
Exactly.
And that is a clear obstacle to these countries' integration into the EU. So if the EU is serious about integrating these countries, then one of the key political issues to tackle are bilateral disputes. Not only bilateral disputes between the candidate countries, but also bilateral disputes between potential candidate
and member countries
and EU member states, of course. And we have had that situation in the past with North Macedonia and Greece, North Macedonia and Bulgaria, Albania, Greece, but also with probably the
Slovenia, Croatia as well.
Yes, of course, before us and outside a bit of our region. But also the Serbia-Kosovo issue is a very serious threat to the accession prospects of all the countries, I would say, in the region. So there should be some renewed awareness and effort on the side of the EU. It has a very important role to play, especially in cases where there is an asymmetry between an EU member state and a candidate country, but also an important role to play in terms of sticks and carrots for countries that are candidates and have disputes between them. That is why we are suggesting that there should be some sort of blueprint, some sort of proactive attitude towards the resolution of these disputes that would run in parallel alongside the accession negotiations or the accession process in general. And also we are putting forward the fact that once these countries have serious prospects to join the EU, or even once they are within the EU, it is increasingly easy to find mutual solutions between them, because the framework of interaction between these countries in the EU institutions in general is really contributing to that effect. And there are numerous examples to this, including maybe one of the most contentious between Ireland and the UK.
Yeah, that is very true. I just wanted to ask you another question about this issue. You recommend that the member states should refrain from using the veto on enlargement policy over bilateral issues and should seek for other ways to resolve their disputes with candidate countries outside the enlargement process. But I guess this requires a different mindset, Dr. Krystinowska, yeah?
Unfortunately, yes. And I'm saying unfortunately because that is probably the most difficult thing to achieve. Nevertheless, it was important for us to pinpoint to the fact that the enlargement process is not the setting where bilateral disputes should be resolved. Unfortunately, the EU does not have any institutional mechanism to resolve bilateral disputes, except for maybe in the area of border disputes. However, it is important to also involve other organizations, international organizations, mediation, arbitration, tribunals that have long-standing experiences in bilateral disputes to assist whenever possible.
Another important element that I wanted to clarify with you is the fact that you recommend that the Council should enable the Commission to make use of the existing mechanisms for immediate reporting and triggering of sanctions for violations or backsliding in the area of rule of law. So basically this rule of law remains at the heart or the core of the issue, isn't it?
It is. That's already acknowledged with the new methodology that was adopted a couple of years ago. And in our expert views, that is how it should be, because rule of law is the underlying basis for all the other reforms. And it is also one of the key priorities for the citizens living in the region. So regardless whether we are on the track to join the EU and how fast that process is going on, rule of law is something that needs to be tackled, that needs to be strengthened for the sake of all the other reforms and for the sake of the well-being of the countries in the region. We are aware that in the past, oftentimes the European institutions have turned a blind eye to backsliding and to violations in the area of rule of law throughout the whole region. And we advocate that that should not continue, and that there should be a very strict conditionality for these countries' accession on the basis of their delivery in the area of rule of law.
And as we are approaching the end of this very interesting discussion, I just wanted to ask you a couple of more questions. Dr. Krystinowska, you underlined the fact that national governments in the Western Balkans should develop and implement specific plans for public administration reform, depoliticization, professionalization, and fight against corruption. These are homeworks that they should have done so far.
of course, that they should have done, but most of them did
have
only
not.
cosmetic reforms. Yes, so that is why we think that it is never enough repeating these aspects, especially if all the countries have the chance to start doing something in the accession process, if they have accession action plans, if, as we propose, negotiations are open for all the countries in the region.
Yeah.
They should have the proper administrative capacity to be able to carry out these reforms, because the EU integration is not a process that concerns only a small fraction of the administration, cabinets of ministers or high officials. It is a process that somehow engages the whole administration. System. And we need to have the best and the brightest people working for the administration, which is not always the case. And that can be somehow turned around if the administration becomes a place that does not depend on political parties and that is increasingly professional administration.
Yeah, that's a key element. Dr. Krzyszynowska, you underline another important element which has a broader spectrum. The European Commission in individual member states should engage in tailored campaign to address the specific concerns of citizens in relation to EU enlargement, be it in the EU or the Western Balkan region. We mentioned at the beginning the fatigue, so basically we need quite the opposite process.
Yes, exactly. We need enlargement to become an open topic, a topic that will be discussed so that the concerns of all the citizens in the EU member states and in the Western Balkans are somehow explained and addressed. In the EU member states, enlargement is often associated with a lot of increased, even illegal migration, with many negative phenomena. And that is not always true, but it is a topic that is somehow contributing to vivid debates. And then in turn, it translates into negative attitude towards enlargement in some countries. We saw it in France, for instance, several years ago, in the Netherlands, and also it is one of the most important tools of the far right. So that has to somehow be addressed. And also in our region, there have been many myths about the accession process, many myths about what the citizens will be or will not be able to do once they join the EU. And that influences their perceptions, whether they want to join or not, and which political parties they are going to support at the elections, whether they are going to support pro-EU parties or I would say rather fringe political parties. And that has also contributed to increased influence, at least in some of the countries, of Russia and maybe other third actors which do not want to see these countries in the EU. So it is very easy to spread disinformation about what will happen when these countries join the EU, anti-EU propaganda, and that also has to be countered in a way through official channels, more strategic communication, and more debate and discussion about the EU membership.
Dr. Krzyszynowska, we basically analyzed what should be done, but based on the negotiations you have had, on the discussions you have had with partner civil society organizations throughout the region and in Europe, do you feel personally enthusiasm regarding the issues that we underlined, that we are moving forward towards a safe discussion where the principles we discussed together are there for everyone?
I have been working on the process for more than 10 years, and I have to say that several years ago, I really lost my personal enthusiasm. However, now with everything that has been happening, I really feel that there is some movement and there is some hope to push forward with the process. And I honestly hope that first and foremost, the governments in the region will realize that and will somehow grab the momentum, demonstrate proactive attitude and responsibility. And I also see that there is some sort of acknowledgement on the side of the EU and willingness to move forward. That was not out there several years ago. It's very important that we have it now, and I really think that on all sides we should definitely use it.
And my final question to you, what do you personally expect as an expert on enlargement from the summit that will take place in Tirana in mid-October?
Well, the summit in Tirana will not be on enlargement. It will be on all the issues that are covered under the Berlin process, and it will also focus a lot on the regional integration.
Exactly.
So my hope is that it will somehow contribute to increase trust between leaders in the region where there is no trust, especially, and between leaders of the region in the Western Balkans and the EU leaders that will be represented there. Because we really need to somehow reset the relationships in order to be able to move forward.
Dr. Anna Kristinovska, thank you very much indeed for your time and the views that you shared with us in Euronews Albania. I am very grateful to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Të nderuar shikues të Euronews Albania, ky ishte Berlin Talks për ditën e sotme. Deri në takimin ton të radhës, nga unë Franco Egro, faleminderit për vëmendjen me cilën na ndoqët dhe miru takofshim.